Join us in a festival that promises to be extraordinary, because Bali is extraordinary.
Well, welcome. My name is Janet Steele, and welcome to the session of the Ubud Readers and Festival 2021 called Gods of the Upper Air with our guest, Charles King. This year, the festival returns with the theme Mula Sarira, or self-reflection, which is drawn from a Balinese Hindu philosophy. From October 8th to 17th, we will explore the meaning of self-reflection, cultural introspection, and human rights, examining who we are, what unites and divides us, and what drives our actions. So I am just thrilled to be here with Charles King, the author of a book called Gods of the Upper Air: How a Circle of Renegade Anthropologists Reinvented Race, Sex, and Gender in the 20th Century. Charles, I just love this book. You know, I've been doing the festivals every year since the very beginning. This is just a great book. This is one of the best books I've ever read. And so I have to say, Charles, I would actually in another context be calling him Dr. King, Professor King, because he's a professor at Georgetown University, currently in Scotland on sabbatical. I'm a professor at George Washington University, just down the road. The names are totally confusing. I'm not on sabbatical, but I'm in Washington, D.C. right now. And I have to say, for those who are not yet familiar with Charles King, he is an academic superstar. I mean, if you look at his website at Georgetown, you know, he's a professor in the Department of Government. He's been the chair. He's taught in the School of Foreign Service. He's on the Council of Foreign Relations. He's written 7 academic books. And now this marvelous book that is so readable about this group of anthropologists centered on Franz Boas at Columbia University. How did you come to sort of switch gears? You're no longer writing about Eastern Europe and Russia. You're fluent in Russian. How did you come to write this?
Well, you're absolutely right. This is a little bit of a departure for me from what I've done before. And let me say, first of all, thank you, Janet, for this conversation, which I'm really looking forward to, and to the festival organizers for inviting me. I'm just really honored and thrilled to be a part of this. You know, I had made the first part of my career writing about Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. I traveled there a lot. I spent a lot of time there. I watched countries collapse from the inside. The Soviet Union itself, Yugoslavia, where I traveled, and a place that I wrote about over the years, the Caucasus, and saw bits of that part of the world erupt in civil war. And as 2015, 2016 rolled around in the United States, I realized that I was seeing things in my own country that were frighteningly similar to things I'd experienced in that other part of the world. The way in which politicians can use nationalism for their own ends, the way that demagoguery works, what happens when one population begins to see itself as the original population for which a country has been designed and made. And then when they start to get nervous about demographic changes that seem to unseat them. And so what I thought I was going to do was write the story of how the United States had developed its own answers to some of these problems, its own answers to some of these questions. After all, this was exactly at the time when really progressive court decisions, progressive legislation was coming forward in areas of race and gender and sexuality in the United States. And I thought I was going to tell this tale about how Americans became so enlightened. And then 2016.
Yikes, yes.
And a president was elected who looked very similar to me to demagogic, ultra-nationalist political figures that I had seen in Eastern Europe. And I thought, wait a minute, I actually have some expertise in nationalism, ethnic conflict, social division. We happen to call it race in the United States, but it doesn't function that much differently from how ethnic politics, say, functions in other parts of the world. And so I wanted to tell a story that ended up being very of the moment, not just historical, but of the moment as well.
And you've certainly done that. I mean, the fascinating thing to me and to everybody who's reviewed this book, and it's had marvelous reviews, it's on the New York Times bestseller list, is the lesson that Franz Boas and his fascinating little circle of incredibly famous anthropologists, the relevance of the cultural relativism that they talked about to today. Would you mind just this is the big theme of your book in my view, just what do they have to say to us today?
Well, I also, the other origin of this book is I happened to marry an anthropologist in 2008. And that turned out to be not only the best decision of my life, but a really terrific decision for my own writing and thinking. Because through her, Maggie Paxson, who is a terrific writer and researcher and traveler, I came to understand the kind of secret sauce of this academic discipline that is just a couple of hallways over from political science, where I live my life. And the secret of anthropology, the great kind of incredible tool at the heart of it, is the idea that, you begin by shutting up. You begin by listening to people, often people who are very different from you, who have different cultural context, different history, different set of goals in life, and try to understand things from the inside. And that's such a rare quality in the politics of today. And in fact, it's been a rare quality throughout modern history, which is why anthropology was such a revolutionary discipline. And the more I delved into this, the more I realized that, of course, the story of the emergence of this American school of cultural anthropology, led by a man named Franz Boas, who came to the United States at the end of the 19th century, became eventually a professor at Columbia University, started the first real department of anthropology in the United States, and then seeded other departments of anthropology with his former PhD students all across the US and indeed around the world. That the story of that discipline was a story of a scientific response to the chauvinism, prejudice, bigotry of the day. Right. And in telling that story, I would come up with some new ways of thinking about how you battle bigotry and prejudice in our own moment.
Right. I mean, it's you do this marvelous job of kind of going back and forth between Boas's story and his academic obsessions, his students' academic obsessions, and then how they are so relevant to today. I guess early on in the book, you say it was one of the great shifts of opinion in the history of science, and the resulting path led straight toward a collision with his adopted country's most time-honored way of understanding itself, a cultural obsession that Europeans and Americans had learned to call race. So tell us about how Boas basically discovered that race doesn't even exist.
Yeah. Well, if you have to understand something about the context in which he was operating. And, at the beginning of the 20th century, Americans, and not just Americans, but plenty of other people around the world, thought of race as the most basic division of human beings. You were born into a race, you inherited it from your parents, and you in turn passed down a race to your children. Now, of course, if you were from a mixed race background, as it was called at the time, you could pass for one race, but it might not be your true race, and your true race was somehow discoverable. And that racial categorization then has something to say about your intelligence, your level of civilization, your fitness for leadership, all of these other things we might care about in society and politics and art and so on. And Boaz, the short story is that Boaz was contracted by the U.S. government to do a study of the physical results of immigration to the United States on the literal American body politic. This, of course, was the time of Ellis Island, of massive immigration to the United States from Eastern and Southern Europe in particular. And the U.S. Congress, which had put together a special commission to study immigration and how it was affecting the United States, asked Boaz to study whether, what the effects on the human body were of all of these new immigrants coming in and reproducing with populations that were already in the U.S. And Boaz was a scientist. He had studied anthropometry, the physical measurement of human beings. And so he sent out teams of scientists all across New York to do physical measurements on lots of different populations, German and Jewish and Polish and Italian and you name it, living in this great multicultural city. And what he discovered was that children born in the United States were more like other children born in the United States physically, irrespective of their background, than they were like the original type from which they came in Poland or Italy or wherever their parents and grandparents happen to be from. And today, this seems like an obvious point to us. Of course, your physical...
Well, it's an obvious point to many of us, but not to all of us.
Not to all, right. I mean, today we might sort of think, well, yeah, that has something to do with prenatal care and nutrition and a whole variety of other things that affect your physical body. But it was revolutionary in 1911 when he published his report, because think about what it meant for a moment. What it meant was that if you can't identify a race based on a set of physical characteristics that are inheritable from parent to child, how can you attribute anything else to race? How can you attribute intelligence to it? Well, maybe intelligence isn't inheritable. Well, maybe criminality isn't inheritable. So this was at that moment, the racial order shook in the United States. It didn't mean that it came crashing down. We still deal with these issues today, obviously, but it began to undermine the idea that there was a thing called racial science, which was taking aim right at the scientific consensus of the day.
It's you do a wonderful job of setting Boaz up against probably someone who at the time was more famous, Madison Grant, and his book, The Passing of the Great Race, which was, I mean, in some ways very similar to what we hear from white supremacists now, that somehow the white race is threatened, the so-called white race is threatened by the influx of what was it? Hombres and what was it Trump said about?
Inferior types.
Inferior types, right.
Right, who are coming into the United States or who are damaging the culture, damaging the civilization, damaging health, all of the things that people might say about immigrants today on the political right. That was very much a consensus view in the early 20th century, actually. And so Boaz is going against the scientific establishment. He's going against some very powerful people who believed that science would show you which groups were fitter, which were more capable of civilization, which were naturally healthier. And then, of course, wouldn't you want, if you knew that, if science could show you that, wouldn't you want to organize your society along those scientific principles? And this, of course, is the birth of eugenics, of the global eugenics movement, which, if you look at the Greek origin of that word, it simply means to be well born, right? In some ways, eugenics was the original human rights movement. It was claiming that, what more basic human right is there than to be born well? And if science can tell you ex ante that you are unlikely to be fit for civilization, you're unlikely to be very intelligent or very good at leadership, because of your background, wouldn't it be better for you not to have been born?
Right.
So, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, and of course, the other group of people who grabbed onto this with great enthusiasm were the Nazis, right? And utilized, the ideas from guys like Madison Grant and the eugenics movement, and you weave that in there too. The similarities.
Right. I mean, the thing we have to come to terms with, especially as Americans, which is that these ideas were not fringe at the time. They were very much part of the scientific establishment. They were part of the political establishment. You know, foreign policy, diplomacy ran along exactly these lines of racial superiority, of a kind of pro-eugenics stance. And as part of the research for this book, you know, at the Library of Congress, you can go in and hold in your hands, in our city of Washington, Adolf Hitler's copy of Madison Grant's Passing of the Great Race, the German translation, which came out in 1925. Hitler very famously called it "my Bible" because it seemed to confirm all of the things that Hitler himself was feeling and sensing as he was writing Mein Kampf in the middle of the 1920s. And so there was a deep connection, as other historians have shown brilliantly before me. There was a deep connection between what was going on in the United States and the eugenics movement, and how museums were organized, and in racial science,
right?
And you know, the views of the Nazis.
Yeah, it's so the theme of the book, actually, you're very explicit about it on page 4. You say, this book is about men and women who found themselves on the front lines of the greatest moral battle of our time, the struggle to prove that despite differences of skin color, gender, ability, or custom, humanity is one undivided thing. So this is the big theme of the book, and it's so important. However, there's also so much other stuff in this book that is just fascinating. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to move away from the big theme and talk about Boas and his school of what you call renegade anthropologists. Sure. First of all, I have to say, I love Boas and his, I mean, what an amazing guy. Born in 1848, the year of the revolutionary year across the world and in Europe, in Prussia, where he was from, the year that Karl Marx wrote his Communist Manifesto. He does his early research, then migrates to the United States, has trouble getting a job, which is interesting. You know, this brilliant anthropologist can't find work. Is it the Chicago World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition of 1897? I mean, I'm an American historian. I studied cultural history at Johns Hopkins. My advisor was John Hyam, who wrote Strangers in the Land, A History of American Nativism. So to read all of this, I mean, Boas's life is like, you know, it just encompasses this almost century of fascinating developments in social thinking. So eventually, after many travails, he ends up getting a job at Columbia University, and there he starts attracting this group of young women. And I wanted to ask you about that. Why are they mostly women? You know, Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead, Zora Neale Hurston, you just super names, superstars, and they all work with him.
Yeah.
First of all, is it a coincidence that they're all women?
Well, he told his son at some point in the late teens, early 20s that all of his best students were women. Mm-hmm. And I think to look at that list of stars that, you know, that you just went through, I think you might have to agree with him. You know, Boas produced an entire generation of anthropologists. He produced, in some ways, most of the first generation of American anthropologists. There was another school at Harvard that was doing the same kind of thing at the time. But American anthropology, as it developed, and then as it kind of spread around the world as one of a number of approaches to doing anthropology, you know, Boas is at the absolute center of that. And one way of telling that story is to focus on the people who became the professors and chairs of anthropology departments at major American universities, from the University of Chicago to Yale to Berkeley and on and on. And when people narrate the history of anthropology, that's kind of traditionally what they've done. And no surprise, those were all men. But what I wanted to do was really to tell the story of people who came out of that same milieu, of that same academic circle, but had a deep impact, in my opinion, on the culture of the United States. You know, not just the academic discipline, but whose writings had a kind of resonance, who took those Boasian ideas, those principles, that research, those findings, and then communicated them to a big audience. And those turned out to be the women. And it was a little bit of an accident of history why the women were in this role, though, because Boas was a great contrarian. He had to be to do the kind of work he did. He was a great writer of letters to the editor, and that's a particular mental, there's a particular mental frame you have to be in to do that a lot. And the university fathers at Columbia got very upset of how outspoken he was. If he had a Twitter account today, he would be under investigation by the university for something he said on Twitter. And so they cut back his teaching at Columbia and sent him across Broadway to teach at Barnard, the women's college of Columbia University. And it was from those seminar rooms at Barnard that this version of public-facing anthropology was born, because that's where, Margaret Mead came into his classroom. That's where Zora Neale Hurston came into his classroom. Over at Teachers College, this woman, Ella Deloria, comes into his classroom, another figure in the circle. And, so from that, from his contrarian nature, comes this entire generation of female scholars and writers.
Right. It's just fascinating. And Charles tells the story of each of these. I just have to emphasize, this is not an academic book. I mean, it has all the heft of an academic book, but it's so readable and so lively. I mean, I love when Margaret Mead arrives at Barnard, and of course, women couldn't get into Columbia. There were no women there until really quite recently. There she is at Barnard. She's already married, but she's having loads of affairs with men and with women. And she hangs out with this group of other young women and students on 116th Street in an apartment, and they call themselves the Ashcan Cats. It's just great. I mean, what a character Margaret Mead is. I mean, all of these women, when you talk earlier in the book about our, not only our understandings of race, but also of gender and sexuality, tell us a little bit. I know this is such a huge topic, but how did their academic research and their lives, what was the relationship, you think, between, Benedict and Mead and Hurston and their research, their quite wild lives, even by today's standards. I don't know anybody that lives like Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict or Zora Neale Hurston.
Yeah. Well, they definitely seized life and tried to squeeze everything they could out of it. And I think in a lot of my work, what I want to try to do is to use individual lives as a way of narrating big stories about ideas, because of course ideas don't float out in the universe untethered from biography. They're deeply connected to biography. And myself, having an anthropologist in the house, I couldn't have written this book without Maggie being around. And but on the page, I kind of went back and forth on how much do I want to dwell on biography, especially the very colorful biography that
which it is very colorful.
Yeah. And what I realized, though, is that this was an essential part of the story, because every character in the book had essentially the same experience at some point in their lives, including Boaz. And it was that they were suddenly, by choice or accident, thrown into a circumstance in which they were having great difficulties. Mm-hmm. Boaz is a German Jewish immigrant to the United States at a time of anti-immigrant backlash, and Mead and Benedict as women who never described themselves as gay or lesbian, but were in this deeply loving same-sex relationship for all of their lives. Hurston is, the only Black student at Barnard at the time, and they decided to put her right in the middle of the class photo. What a target that is. And so they found themselves in these difficult, uncomfortable circumstances, and they realized that, well, that is attributable to one of two things. Either I'm broken in some way, I'm deficient, I'm defective, I'm abnormal in some sense. Or there's something about how I'm fine, but something about how I as a person relate to the culture, the values, the mores, the circumstances in which I, by chance, happen to find myself. And from that germ of an insight grows all of modern social science, actually,
Right.
not just anthropology, but this idea that we are shaped deeply, deeply shaped by the circumstances, institutions, culture, society, habits around us. And then how can we explain individual or group level behavior by understanding the context in which it happens? And there's such a debate in the United States today about a thing called critical race theory.
Right.
But the insight of critical race theory, if it's even a theory, is simply that if you're trying to understand life arcs, begin not with the ability or disability of the person you're trying to study, but begin by understanding how this perfectly fine person is situated in the historical, social, institutional context.
Right.
And so that was their great insight. And it's revolutionary in the way that we begin to think about big social change or social problems or issues we want to address.
Right. That's what I would say the second big theme of the book. You write, what if our experiences and observations are themselves the problem? What if we are gazing at the world through spectacles of our own making, inherently hemmed in by our own experience, which, as you say, you point out the connections between the lives of each of these anthropologists, how each of them had this moment where they realized there's nothing wrong with me. It's the way we're defining things. But I want to just highlight something else you just said, which I think is so important. And, a lot of the people who attend this festival are writers or lovers of good writing. And I teach the only skills class I teach in our department is a narrative writing class. And you have done a marvelous job of having the main theme being the main character, but each of you do tell, as you said it far better than I, you tell it through the biographies of these fascinating men and women. And each time you manage to relate each of the biographies, and they're great biographies, they're fascinating lives, back to this main theme. And it's really beautifully done. I'd love to teach this in a writing class, how you set this up. And it's so readable and so interesting. Was it hard to figure that out? I'm sure you did all your research, and then did you have trouble thinking, how on earth am I going to hang all this together?
Yeah, with every book, I feel like I have tried to recover what like an 11-year-old version of me wanted to do before I went to graduate school.
Good way to put it.
Because graduate school can beat out of you a love of great writing if you're not careful. And so I feel like I've been kind of clawing back and certainly learning how to do that by reading just really terrific, narrative nonfiction writers. And one of my editors over the years, when I was trying to do a much more academic kind of approach where, you lay out your big themes first and then you step back and, develop each of those themes, or you have chapters that are much more thematic rather than narrative. And she said to me quite brilliantly and simply, chronology is your friend. Mm-hmm. And I think that's exactly right. That, in a way, all I had to do in this book, once I got out of my own way, all I had to do in this book was follow the threads of their lives. And what you see is that, none of them knew where they were going. Of course, none of us knows where we're going in life or in writing and scholarship, whatever. You're kind of making it up as you go along, and you go down some dead ends, and then you have to backtrack. And so part of the book also is trying to show moments when these brilliant thinkers are being very dumb. And they don't quite understand it yet, but they have to go down these cul-de-sacs and then back up and realize that, the stuff I was saying about this society or this culture that I've just been visiting, that's really a load of nonsense. And in fact, the one who did that best, I think, is Hurston. She is in some ways the beating heart of the book, I think. And if she gave it the title, Gods of the Upper Air, that's her phrase. Yeah. And she kind of lived Boasian principles perhaps more fully than anybody else in this group.
Yeah, actually, I was going to ask you about the title, and I read a couple interviews where you explained it's something that she said, and it's in the précis of your book. She said, "I've walked in storms with a crown of clouds above my head and the zigzag lightning playing through my fingers. The gods of the upper air have uncovered their faces to my eyes." So who are the gods of the upper air?
Yeah, so we had a difficult time with the title. The book was originally called something else, and there was called something else still. And then we were getting closer to publication, and without a title, you can't have a cover. Without a cover, you can't have a publication. So, but I was reading her autobiography, Dust Tracks on the Road, rereading. I'd read it before for the research for this. And I came across this phrase, read it out loud to my wife, Maggie. She said, "Well, there's your title, Gods of the Upper Air." Because what Hurston is trying to say here, very poetically, is that she has, to the degree possible, thrown herself into another place, another culture, another society, and tried to feel that from the inside. Their gods, the zigzag lightning of a religious experience, say. She went through multiple, for example, voodoo initiation rituals in New Orleans and Haiti. She jumped in to with both feet into the idea of trying to understand another place from the inside. And she says elsewhere in that quote that, in all of these travels and all of this reflection, all these writing up field notes, she hasn't really discovered anything that's universally true. That is a universal principle other than the essential unity of human beings. But she has had these moments of almost religious insight by being able to see how other people live their lives.
Right.
And that is why, the book is about science, and it has science at its core. These people were scientists and thought of themselves in that way. But they also had a moral mission, if you like, and that morality came from the science rather than the other way around.
Right.
Morality came right out of the science. That the concept of the essential unity of human beings is not a religious or philosophical principle. It's a scientifically demonstrable.
Yeah. And I grew up in Florida, and I'm a huge fan of Zora Neale Hurston. And you've written the best stuff I've ever read about her. And for people who are interested, there's a wonderful story of how she actually finds a real zombie. But we'll leave that and have them read it, because there's other stuff I want to ask you about. As you know, the festival is set in Bali, and it's certainly a shame that we're all not in Bali. But Bali has quite a cameo appearance in your book. In 1936, Margaret Mead leaves what was by that time her third husband, Rio Fortune, her second husband. And she goes to Bali, who was a famous anthropologist. She goes to Bali with another famous anthropologist named Gregory Bateson. They're there for 2 years. You write they're interested in trances. And she takes, and you have to wait for this, 25,000 photographs, which I gather are in her Library of Congress collection.
Exactly right.
Where were they? Because this is the Bali Festival. Where were they in Bali, and exactly what were they doing?
Well, so they moved around a lot. So they were in, and I don't recall exactly where they were in this 2-year period, but they were interested in a thing that I think ultimately turned out to be not particularly productive as a field of anthropology, which is in some ways the overlap of psychology or psychoanalysis of the day. This is a very 1930s to 60s type of sort of set of projects. The intersection of culture and psychoanalysis. And but what came out of that research, and it's all there in the Library of Congress and now belongs to the people of the United States, is this whole set of remarkable recordings of dance and trance behavior in Bali and elsewhere that they collected during their journeys. Wow. So there are, as you say, tens of thousands of photographs, but also thousands of hours of film.
Wow.
And
hey, grad students out there, be listening to this. I mean, that sounds fantastic.
Shot on, black and white kind of Super 8 or its predecessor, film, and it's quite remarkable. And I only sampled a portion of this, but it's really worth seeing, and I think is a great snapshot. I mean, lots of snapshots of a culture and a period.
And I want to get back to some of the high notes, but before we do, I found a kind of interesting little bit of a dark underside to some of this anthropological work. And actually, ironically, it seemed to me most obvious with Margaret Mead. There's almost, I mean, she and her lovers and husbands were everywhere doing everything, writing incredible work that we still read. But she also, one time I heard a colleague describe what he called the extractive model of anthropology, and he's an anthropologist, and you go into a place and you extract things, and then you leave and you write it up. And you mentioned a very sad note that Margaret Mead got from her main informant in Samoa, and her this was only 2 years after she'd left, right? And she writes, but where are you now? We haven't received a single letter from you. Why haven't you written to us? I wish you'd write to us. We love you so much, and we still remember you. Yeah. And I read that and I thought, wow, that's an interesting insight about anthropology too. That and I've done ethnographic research in newsrooms, and I read that and I felt kind of a pang, like, you're there and you have these intense relationships, and then you leave and you write it up, and that's that. Did you find that elsewhere, or was that sort of an unusual thing about that you just ran across?
No, I mean, and there was so much when I was reading Mead's notes from the field, or her letters back to her advisor, her PhD advisor, Boaz, which were really fascinating to read, because it was like looking at the correspondence that I might have with a PhD student of mine who's out in the field doing some kind of work. You realize that, not only are there issues of not knowing what you're doing there, and not knowing what a good research trip will be, and not understanding, you're flailing on the ground trying to understand a place is very unlike the one you're familiar with. But I think she probably didn't recognize this as much as some of the other people in the circle. But as you say, there's an exploitative dimension to how you're collecting the thing that you call data. These are real people's lives, real people's experiences, sometimes quite traumatic events that you're asking them about or collecting information on. And, in talking with my wife about her experiences in the field, and the ones that I had when I was doing my PhD and then beyond, I dealt with real live people, not just archives, and the work that I've done too. This should weigh on us. And I think, there is a lot to be done, particularly in global North higher education, to try to understand ways in which that can be done much more ethically. And of course, many people write about this and talk about this and build into graduate programs, but it's probably not where at the level that it needs to be. The ethical dimensions.
Was she aware of this? Did Margaret Mead have some self-awareness about this, of what she was doing, or did you just happen to stumble across this letter?
No, I think some. I don't think it. She had long-term friendships, relationships with people whom she met in far-flung places, right? And so it was not all that she just left and never kept in touch with them. In fact, all of these, the 500,000 items in the Margaret Mead archives of the Library of Congress, a fair number of them, are letters that she wrote back to, kept in touch with people, made multiple visits, and so on.
Yeah.
But she thought of herself as a scientist, and at some stage, you are the person in the white lab coat, and folks on the ground are your subjects.
Right.
And I think that I'm glad you mentioned that, because I wanted to highlight that dilemma. They were doing.
Well, you highlight another dilemma, which I think may be more relevant to a lot of people. One of the interesting things about the Ubud Festival is it does attract a lot of Indonesian members of the audience, but also a number of expats who love Bali, who love Indonesia. And you have a great quote actually from Margaret Mead, where she says, I guess your you're paraphrasing, that you write, anthropology was science, she believed, but it was also an act of translation. You had to use the imperfect language of your own society to try to make sense of another. So what are the implications of that, you think, for those of us who want to understand another culture, whether it's Bali or Indonesia, whether it's the culture of anthropologists? I mean, could you talk a little bit about that translation?
Yeah. Well, I think from Mead, Boas, I mean, all of them, I think one of the lessons they want to try to impart is there's really a multi-step process. But if you want to boil down their scientific method to a kind of style of living or rules for living your everyday life, it really comes down to two things. First of all, begin with humility. Begin with the idea that your way of seeing the world, your cultural perspective on the world is not the only one, not the best one, not the obvious or commonsensical one. And then the second thing is practice this, right? Now, they ended up throwing themselves into places that were very different from the ones they knew. Boas on Baffin Island in the Canadian Arctic, Mead in Bali and American Samoa and elsewhere, Benedict in the American Southwest, Hurston in Haiti. But there are all around us people and groups and societies that think very differently from how we do. And as I've said to many of American readers that I've talked to or at events, I've said, one of the places where this is obvious is across a political divide. They were doing the really hard work of their era. I mean, to go to American Samoa in the 1920s and suggest that there was something to be discovered there of worth, that seemed absolutely bizarre to most that Mead encountered. And so we have to try to identify in our own moment what are the really difficult places to go, really difficult things to try to understand from the inside.
Right. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so I mean, for most American university professors, going to Bali or American Samoa, it seems like an obvious thing to do, not a bizarre or strange thing to do. So you have to kind of figure out in your own moment the places that will break your common sense, because that's what they're looking for.
I like that you use the word humility, because I think that's another interesting thing. We haven't talked about Ella Deloria, the Dakota Sioux activist who did so much with language, and just this idea that in my life, even if I'm fluent in Indonesian, I have to explain what I've heard in English, and I may not actually be able to do that. And then it's very likely that an Indonesian will be the equivalent of this wonderful subject to what I think Two Crows, who would always say, well, that's not the way it is at all. And I think we've all had that experience. We think we've had this breakthrough. We found something, we understand it, we write it up, and then somebody, maybe one of our sources, says, no, you got it wrong. That's not the way it is. That we're limited. Yeah.
And I mean, it is always a struggle. You are always engaged in an imperfect task of translating, but that's true of most of us throughout most of our lives. We're translating a different conceptual space. We're translating different language. We're translating different, how do you explain what a religious experience is to someone who's never had that religious experience? So they were, rather than putting those issues under the table and saying, well, science will get on without thinking about those problems, they were putting them front and center. And it doesn't mean that you can't say anything about anything. That's not the message of cultural relativism at all. But it is to say that the world is a great panoply of different experiences, different worldviews, different definitions of common sense. And part of our task as good scientists and good moral human beings is to try to catalog as many of those as we can before they disappear. The grand theories about humanity can wait. Let's just grab up the wealth of human experience as it gets thinner and thinner.
Right. This is just the most marvelous book, full of these rip-roaring stories and these lives, which are just, amazing. Boas himself sees the beginnings of what would become he was alive at the beginning of the Second World War. He dies in 1942 in a rather amazing way. He drops dead at the Columbia University Faculty Club. we should all be so lucky. And his last words are, we should never stop repeating the idea that racism is a monstrous error and an impudent lie.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, think about that. Think about the arc of his life and where he, you know, he came from a country that would end up becoming the most horrific example of state-led racism in human history, in what would become Nazi Germany. And he lived and made his career in a country that had perfected a system of racial categorization and segregation. So he spent his entire life battling these issues. And, you know, to me, that's also really inspirational. Mm-hmm. If Boas can do it, if Hurston can do it, you know, what a lesson for most of us to, especially at a time when it can seem that we're sliding backward rather than moving forward.
Right, right. Well, you know, I've told all my friends to read this book. It's really just wonderful and has such important ideas. And you're such a good storyteller and such a good writer. And, you know, I'm going to remind my students that academic writing doesn't have to be boring either. That, you know, there's a lot of, this is a really a grand book, and the people in it, and you do justice to the people you write about. I think we are pretty close to being out of time. So while we leave on a glorious note, let me first just thank you. This was really fun, and I so enjoyed reading the book. And so I'd also like to thank the audience. Thank you for supporting the Yayasan Mudra Swari Saraswati Patrons Program. I'd like to thank the festival's partners who made the Ubud Writers and Readers Festival possible. You can find a whole list of them on the website. Again, Charles King, thank you so much. Your book, Gods of the Upper Air, How a Circle of Renegade Anthropologists Reinvented Race, Sex, and Gender in the 20th Century, is just terrific. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Shane. Really wonderful conversation. Thanks for making time.
Thanks.